The Russia-Ukraine war has raged for over a year with devastating human costs and global ripple effects. The resilience of the Ukrainian people and international support highlight the conflict's significance. However, the war underscores the fragility of peace and the consequences of unchecked aggression. As the conflict evolves, understanding its motivations and implications is crucial. Please subscribe if you like the content. The US has condemned Russia's actions and provided significant aid to Ukraine, reflecting broader strategic interests.
The Biden administration frames the conflict as a battle between democracy and autocracy. The US has rallied allies to impose sanctions on Russia, aiming to pressure Putin to end the war.
Understanding the factors behind US involvement is crucial to comprehending the conflict's dynamics. The decisions made by the US will shape the future of Europe and the global order. Therefore, delving into the motivations and implications of American involvement is essential. The US involvement in Ukraine is about upholding a rules-based international order and deterring future aggression.
To grasp US involvement, we must dissect the historical context and strategic chessboard. The US sees Russia's actions as a direct challenge to its global leadership.
We'll explore the reasons behind America's support for Ukraine, separating fact from fiction. To understand the US's stance, we must revisit the Cold War era. The collapse of the Soviet Union left a complex legacy influencing today's dynamics. The Cold War instilled a deep-seated distrust of Russian intentions in the US. The annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine are seen as Russia's attempt to reclaim its lost empire. The US views its support for Ukraine as a way to contain Russian expansionism. Understanding this historical context is crucial to deciphering the motivations driving both sides. NATO expansion has been a source of tension between the US and Russia. The US championed NATO expansion, extending its security umbrella to former Soviet bloc countries. Russia views NATO expansion as a threat to its security interests. The US maintains that NATO is a defensive alliance, but critics argue it failed to consider Russia's concerns. The debate over NATO expansion highlights the complexities of post-Cold War security in Europe. The early 21st century saw pro-democracy uprisings in former Soviet republics. The US supported these revolutions, challenging Russia's influence. Putin viewed these uprisings as Western attempts to weaken Russia. This perception fueled his paranoia and solidified his belief that the West was working against him. The legacy of the color revolutions continues to shape Putin's perception of the West. The Budapest Memorandum provided security assurances to Ukraine in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons. Russia's actions in Crimea and eastern Ukraine are seen as violations of the memorandum. Ukraine argues that the US and UK have failed to uphold their commitments. The US maintains it has honored the spirit of the memorandum by providing support to Ukraine. The Budapest Memorandum highlights the challenges of enforcing international agreements. The US views Ukraine as a crucial buffer state against Russian expansionism.
If Ukraine falls, it could embolden Putin to target other former Soviet republics.
By supporting Ukraine, the US aims to deter further Russian aggression.
This is about preserving a rules-based international order. A world where might makes right is a recipe for chaos and instability.
The European Union represents peace, prosperity, and democratic values. The war in Ukraine threatens the EU's unity and global standing.
A Russian victory in Ukraine would be a setback for the European project.
By supporting Ukraine, the US aims to preserve Europe's stability and prosperity.
The US sees its support for Ukraine as an investment in Europe's future.
The war in Ukraine has disrupted the global energy market. Russia has weaponized its resources, cutting off supplies to Europe. The US recognizes the strategic importance of energy security. The US is working to increase its energy production and exports to Europe. Beyond energy, the war has broader economic implications, disrupting global supply chains and fueling inflation. Section 4. Maintaining US credibility and global leadership. The US has long positioned itself as the guarantor of global security, the defender of democracy, and the champion of a rules-based international order. Its actions or inactions in the face of crises like the war in Ukraine have consequences for its credibility and leadership on the world stage.
Failure to support Ukraine would send a dangerous message to both allies and adversaries. It would signal that the US is unwilling to back up its words with action, that it is no longer committed to defending its values, and that it is content to allow authoritarian powers to reshape the world in their image. This would undermine US credibility, embolden its rivals, and erode its global standing.
Conversely, by standing firm with Ukraine, the US demonstrates its commitment to its principles, its resolve in the face of aggression, and its willingness to defend the international rules-based order. This strengthens US credibility, reassures allies, and deters future aggression.
The war in Ukraine is a test of US leadership in the 21st century. The decisions made today will have lasting consequences for the US's ability to shape global events, advance its interests, and promote its values.
Section 5. The stakes of inaction, a world unmoored. Some argue that the US should limit its involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war, that it's a regional conflict with limited strategic importance to the US, and that excessive involvement risks escalating the conflict and harming American interests. However, such arguments fail to grasp the broader stakes involved and the potential consequences of inaction. Allowing Russia to succeed in Ukraine would have far-reaching consequences, emboldening authoritarian regimes worldwide, undermining the rules-based international order, and emboldening other aggressors. It would signal that might makes right and that the US is no longer willing or able to defend its interests and values. A world where aggression is tolerated, where borders are redrawn by force, and where authoritarianism flourishes is a dangerous and unstable world, one that would ultimately harm US interests. It would embolden rivals like China, increase the risk of conflict, and erode the very foundations of global peace and security. The US cannot afford to be passive in the face of such a challenge. The stakes are simply too high. The war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order, the principles of democracy and freedom, and the kind of world we want to live in. Democracy at the crossroads. The US has long seen itself as a beacon of freedom, shaping its foreign policy. The Ukraine war is viewed as a battle between democracy and authoritarianism. Russia, under Putin, has moved towards authoritarianism, suppressing dissent. Ukraine, despite challenges, embraces democratic reforms and free elections. The US supports Ukraine to defend democratic values against authoritarianism. This is about upholding a world order where democracy can flourish. A stand for freedom and self-determination. Self-determination is a cornerstone of international law and American foreign policy. The US advocates for nations to chart their own course, free from coercion. Russia's invasion of Ukraine strikes at this principle. Ukrainians defending their homeland show a nation's determination. The US supports Ukraine to defend sovereignty and territorial integrity. Redrawing borders by force will not be tolerated. This commitment is about upholding a world order where all nations are free. Section 3. Human rights and the moral imperative. War is a humanitarian catastrophe. The conflict in Ukraine has resulted in immense human suffering with countless civilian casualties and cities reduced to rubble. The United States champions human rights as a central pillar of its foreign policy. Atrocities in Ukraine remind us of the need for a rules-based international order. Supporting Ukraine is a moral imperative, defending the innocent and holding perpetrators accountable. The war in Ukraine emphasizes the active pursuit of peace, justice, and human rights. Section 1. A New Iron Curtain. Reshaping Alliances and Partnerships. The war in Ukraine has shattered the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe, forcing a reassessment of alliances and partnerships. The most immediate impact has been the revitalization of NATO. NATO has been jolted back into relevance, with member states increasing defense spending and deploying troops to Eastern Europe. Beyond NATO, the war has prompted a broader realignment of global partnerships. Finland and Sweden have abandoned their neutrality and applied for NATO membership. The war in Ukraine has drawn a sharp dividing line between those who support a rules-based international order and those who seek to undermine it.
The conflict in Ukraine has undeniably reshaped the geopolitical landscape. For the European Union, this has meant a closer alignment with NATO and a more coordinated approach to security and defense policy.
Section 2. Testing the limits, China's balancing act. The war in Ukraine presents China with a complex dilemma. China shares Russia's distrust of the West and desire to challenge the US-led order. They have deepened economic and military cooperation, raising concerns in the West. Yet, China is wary of aligning too closely with Russia due to international condemnation. China is carefully watching the international response, assessing potential consequences. The war highlights risks of economic interdependence, especially in strategic sectors. China aims to reduce its vulnerability to Western sanctions and pressure. Section 3. The Global South, a divided landscape. The war in Ukraine has exposed deep divisions within the Global South, the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. While many countries have condemned Russia's invasion and supported Ukraine's territorial integrity, others have remained neutral or even expressed tacit support for Russia. This divide reflects a complex web of factors, including historical ties to Russia, resentment towards the West, economic dependence on Russian energy or trade, and a desire to avoid choosing sides in a conflict perceived as primarily a European affair. Some countries see Russia's actions as a challenge to the West's dominance and a potential opportunity to advance their own interests in a multipolar world. The war has also exacerbated existing global inequalities, particularly in terms of food and energy security. Developing countries, already struggling with the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic, are now facing soaring food and energy prices, driven in part by disruptions caused by the war. The US and its allies face a significant challenge in building and maintaining support for Ukraine within the Global South. Addressing the concerns of developing countries, particularly regarding the economic impact of the war, will be crucial to ensuring a united and effective response to Russian aggression. Section 4. The Nuclear Shadow, Managing Existential Risks. The war in Ukraine has brought the world face to face with the spectre of nuclear conflict. Russia, possessing the world's largest nuclear arsenal, has repeatedly made veiled threats about the potential use of nuclear weapons, raising fears of escalation and miscalculation. The US and its allies have walked a fine line, providing Ukraine with substantial military aid while seeking to avoid actions that could be perceived by Russia as escalatory. The Biden administration has engaged in direct communication with Moscow to reduce the risk of miscalculation and to reiterate the unacceptable consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. The war has underscored the importance of nuclear arms control and the need for renewed dialogue and diplomacy to reduce nuclear risks. The New START Treaty, the last remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the US and Russia, is set to expire in 2026. Raising concerns about a potential new nuclear arms race. The war in Ukraine has served as a stark reminder of the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons and the imperative of preventing their use. The international community must work together to reduce nuclear risks, strengthen arms control regimes, and pursue a world free from the threat of nuclear annihilation. Section 5, a marathon, not a sprint navigating long-term competition. The war in Ukraine is not a short-term crisis, it is a defining moment that will shape the international order for decades to come. The United States and its allies are engaged in a long-term competition with Russia, one that will require sustained commitment, strategic patience, and a willingness to adapt to a changing geopolitical landscape. The United States must balance its immediate goal of supporting Ukraine with its broader strategic objectives, which include deterring future Russian aggression, strengthening the transatlantic alliance, and maintaining a stable and prosperous Europe. This will require a multifaceted approach that combines military support for Ukraine, economic pressure on Russia, and diplomatic engagement with both allies and adversaries. The United States must also prepare for a world in which Russia is increasingly isolated and hostile, seeking to undermine Western interests and sow discord within the international community. This will require a renewed focus on strengthening alliances, countering Russian disinformation, and building resilience against hybrid threats. The war in Ukraine is a marathon, not a sprint. The United States and its allies must remain steadfast in their support for Ukraine, while also preparing for the long game, adapting to a more complex and dangerous world, and working to build a more peaceful and prosperous future. Section 1. The Endgame Defining Success in Ukraine. The United States faces a complex and evolving set of goals in Ukraine, balancing immediate needs with long-term strategic objectives. The most pressing goal is to ensure Ukraine's survival as a sovereign and independent nation. This means providing Ukraine with the military and economic assistance it needs to defend itself against Russian aggression and to withstand the economic shocks of the war. However, simply maintaining a stalemate is not enough. The United States also seeks to help Ukraine achieve a favorable outcome in the war, one that restores its territorial integrity and deters future Russian attacks. This requires a delicate balance, providing Ukraine with the means to defend itself without provoking an escalatory spiral with Russia. The United States also aims to impose significant costs on Russia for its aggression, both to punish Moscow for its actions and to deter future aggression against Ukraine and other neighbors. This includes a combination of economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military support for Ukraine. Ultimately, the United States envisions a Ukraine that is not only free and independent, but also democratic, prosperous, and integrated with the West. This requires supporting Ukraine's long-term economic and political development, helping it build a more resilient and prosperous society that can withstand future challenges. Section 2. Rebuilding Ukraine, a generational endeavor. Even if the guns fall silent tomorrow, the task of rebuilding Ukraine will be a generational endeavor, requiring a sustained international commitment and a comprehensive approach that addresses both the physical and societal scars of war. The physical rebuilding of Ukraine, its infrastructure, its economy, its homes and its cities will require billions of dollars in investment and a coordinated effort from international partners. But beyond bricks and mortar, there's the human cost of war to consider. Trauma runs deep, and the psychological wounds of war will take years, if not generations, to heal. The United States and its partners must be prepared to provide long-term support for mental health services, trauma counseling, and programs to address the needs of veterans and families torn apart by conflict. Rebuilding Ukraine is not just about restoring what was lost, but also about building a better future, a more democratic, transparent, and resilient society. This means supporting good governance, strengthening the rule of law, and tackling corruption, creating a Ukraine that is more resistant to external pressures and more attractive to foreign investment. The war in Ukraine has exposed the shortcomings of the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe highlighting the need for a new framework that can effectively deter aggression, reassure allies, and manage a more assertive and unpredictable Russia.
This will require a renewed commitment to NATO, with increased defense spending, a more robust forward presence in Eastern Europe, and a clear articulation of the alliance's commitment to collective defense.
But it also requires thinking beyond NATO, exploring new mechanisms for security cooperation that include non-NATO members in Europe, particularly those bordering Russia that feel most vulnerable.
This new security architecture must address not only traditional military threats, but also hybrid threats, such as cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and economic coercion, which Russia has increasingly employed to undermine its adversaries.
It also requires a long-term strategy for managing relations with Russia, one that combines deterrence with dialogue, seeking to prevent conflict while also addressing areas of common interest. The US-Russia relationship is likely to remain adversarial for the foreseeable future. The war in Ukraine has exacerbated existing tensions, deepened mistrust, and diminished the prospects for cooperation.
However, the US cannot afford to ignore Russia or to allow the relationship to deteriorate into unrestrained hostility.
The US must pursue a dual-track approach combining firmness on core principles and interests with selective engagement where possible.
This means maintaining a credible military deterrent to deter Russian aggression, while also leaving open channels for diplomacy to manage crises, reduce the risk of miscalculation, and address areas of shared concern such as arms control and non-proliferation.
The US must also work to counter Russian disinformation and propaganda, both domestically and internationally, to prevent Moscow from exploiting divisions within and among Western countries.
This will require a concerted effort to expose and counter Russian narratives, to support independent media, and to strengthen societal resilience against foreign interference.
Managing the US-Russia relationship will require a long-term perspective, strategic patience, and a willingness to adapt to a changing geopolitical landscape. The goal is not to befriend Russia, but to manage the competition in a way that prevents conflict, advances US interests, and promotes a more stable and secure world. The US is deeply entangled in the Russia-Ukraine war, a conflict that lays bare the fault lines of the 21st century. We've unpacked the historical baggage, strategic chess game, and clash of ideologies that brought us to this point. It's messy, it's complex, and there are no easy answers. Some argue that it's not America's fight, that the costs outweigh the benefits. But can the US, a nation that has long championed freedom and democracy, stand idly by as a sovereign nation is devoured by a more powerful neighbor? Can it risk the unraveling of the international order, the emboldening of autocrats worldwide? The US has chosen to act not out of blind idealism, but out of a calculated understanding of what's at stake. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. A willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it demands sacrifice. The billions of dollars in aid, the diplomatic tightrope walk, the constant threat of escalation. These are the costs of confronting a bully, of defending a world order where might doesn't make right. The road ahead is uncertain, fraught with peril and potential pitfalls. There will be setbacks, tough choices, and moments where the path forward seems shrouded in fog. But even amidst the darkness, there are glimmers of hope. The Ukrainian people, through their resilience and courage, have reminded the world of the indomitable spirit of freedom. The international community, despite its divisions, has come together in ways few predicted, imposing costs on the aggressor and providing a lifeline to the besieged. The US, through its leadership and resolve, has reaffirmed its commitment to a world where democracy can flourish, where sovereignty is respected, and where the rule of law prevails over the rule of the jungle. The war in Ukraine is a tragedy, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the ever-present threat of tyranny. But it is also a call to action, an opportunity to forge a more secure and just world for generations to come. The choices made today, the sacrifices borne, will determine the course of history. Let us choose wisely, let us act decisively, and let us never waver in our defense of freedom.